prior to a shutdown and during the entire shutdown. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. John Fleming.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend Congressman Wilson. I also thank my good friend Doug Collins for bringing this measure up today. Mr. Speaker, the First Amendment rights of our military do not sunset with the lack of appropriations or even a shutdown. The free exercise of religion is codified in the Constitution of the United States and celebrated by every American, including those of us who have, do, or will wear the uniform. Military chaplains faithfully serve a unique role in the military, bridging the gap between faith and freedom and ensuring that peoples of all beliefs are able to celebrate Mass or participate in a worship service according to the dictates of their faith. Despite this protected right, the Department of Defense has decided to effectively close the doors of many churches and chapels this weekend by not allowing military chaplains to perform their religious duties on military installations because the federal government has not passed the relevant appropriations bill of FY 2014. Mr. Speaker, I contend that the freedom of religion does not follow the federal government's fiscal policy. The freedom of religion is a 24/7 constitutional right that should garner unconditional support from this administration and our military leaders. I stand strong with the brave men and women serving in our nation's military and urge my colleagues to support this resolution. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for yielding. The President of the United States has spent weeks of his term negotiating with the Republican Party, and what he's been confronted with each time is a demand to either shut the government down or default on the country's debt. But I want to put this in another frame of reference as I rise in support of this bill. On 8 occasions when President George W. Bush was president, we had the majority on our side, and we agreed to a continuing resolution, a clean continuing resolution. We had our many differences with President Bush over the Iraq War, over issues of health care, over issues of the budget, but on 8 occasions, President Bush came to the Democratic majority and asked to continue running the government, and we said yes. The principle at stake here is whether negotiation means you have to have everything you want all the time and shut the government down if you don't. That's not the way we do business. That's why 3/4 of the American people agree that shutting the government down over the health care law is the wrong thing to do. I yield back.
Yields back his time. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the Congresswoman from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have all heard, we received this news yesterday that our priests and ministers could end up facing government arrest if they attempt to celebrate Mass or openly practice their faith on a military base during this government shutdown, a shutdown we did not want, a shutdown that could have been avoided had the President and Senator Reid agreed to negotiate with us. This is so unfortunate, and what we see is no Mass, no communion, no confession, no prayer, no faith, no religion. But, Mr. Speaker, what we have to realize is that religious beliefs predate government. Government should not be able to tell those who are religious whether they can practice their faith freely, regardless of our government funding situation. What we are seeking is accountability, transparency, and reducing what the federal government spends. Government funding is irrelevant to the religious rights and freedoms that are enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. And some don't get to throw away the Constitution just because they're unwilling to sit down and negotiate and work with us through this process. We're not going to sit here and say, even if you volunteer to serve the faithful, that we are going to deny you. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, will our priests and ministers this weekend, some of them on my post at Fort Campbell in my district, are they going to be arrested if they recite a Hail Mary, if they lead in prayer? I think that it is time for us to pass this legislation to agree that we let our men and women in uniform pray. Let America pray. Government shouldn't arrest anyone because some want to play politics with this situation. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, again, I support this resolution. Nobody is getting arrested for praying. I really wish we could keep the debate here in the realm of reality. I believe the issue is that they have been furloughed in some instances, so they're not allowed to carry on the services. So I don't want that misimpression left dangling out there that somehow we're arresting people for going to church. We are most certainly not, and I wish the debate would remain a little bit more accurate. And I want to make just one other point. While it is true that in '95 President Clinton talked to the Republicans, ultimately he did not give them any of the policy items that they were asking for. And all President Obama basically is saying, look, you want to talk, we can talk, but we can't talk about dismantling my health care law, and we can't talk about adding policy riders to the CR or to the debt ceiling, because we need to keep the government running. And there is one other difference, which I know my Republican colleagues will not address. The Republican majority under Newt Gingrich in 1995 gave this House a vote, just like the Senate has given everything you've sent over to them a vote. They voted it down, but they had a vote. This House will not give us a vote on the CR that the Senate has passed. If you feel as strongly about it as you do what the Republicans in 1995 did. Bring it up and vote it down. That's democracy. That's in the Constitution too, by the way. That would be helpful. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
And Mr. Smith, I appreciate, again, your support of this, but it is important because, sadly, information has been provided that chaplains would be subject to trespassing charges. So this does obviously interfere with the ability of freedom of speech and religion and assembly. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Tim Hulskamp.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, is it really the policy of this administration to make church services illegal, to threaten Catholic priests with jail if they celebrate Mass this weekend? Unfortunately, this policy seems to be another tragic reflection of the complete disregard this administration has for Americans of faith. What's worse, it's an unprecedented denial of a fundamental constitutional right of our men and women in uniform, like denying access to the World War II or Lincoln memorials for the first time. This is the first time in 17 previous funding lapses covering 16 Sundays that our brave chaplains have been threatened with arrest if they perform their godly duties. Secretary Hagel must issue an immediate directive that chaplains should continue to perform their duties and that DoD facilities normally used for religious services should continue to be used. Mr. Speaker, the First Amendment is not some empty words on a dusty, archaic document to be viewed somewhere in a museum. No, for men like my uncle, Father Leonard Stegman, who was a chaplain, active duty chaplain for nearly 30 years, the First Amendment is what you do every day as a chaplain, leading men and women of all faiths. It's something real for the late Father Emil Capon, who was recently awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama on April 11th of this year. For Father Emil, the First Amendment was not, again, some empty words. It's what he did every day. It's the reason he gave his life for his country. It's the reason he is honored and recognized, and how he drew men and women of all faith. In honor of Father Capon and all current and former military chaplains and all members of the armed forces, Let's strike a blow for religious liberty today, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution and send a clear message to this administration that the rights of those serving in our armed forces cannot be suspended simply to create political and personal pain. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
I reserve as well.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield the remainder of the time to the sponsor of this resolution, the U.S. Air Force Reserve Chaplain, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Doug Collins.
How much time?
Mr. Smith, do you have any other speakers you'd like to yield?
Sorry. I do not. You have the right to close, so I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back his time. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized. And
I yield to the sponsor of this resolution, Congressman Doug Collins, a U.S. Air Force Reserve Chaplain.
Gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from South Carolina whose dedication to our men and women in uniform is among no peer in this body, and I thank him for his service and for the fight of his family and others as we come along. I tell you today, I rise, Mr. Speaker, really with a troubled heart, but also with one that is on behalf of the men and women in the Air Force and the armed forces and other that are facing something today that they should not have to have faced. There's no doubt our nation is facing many difficulties, and both we across the aisle can understand that, and the majority in this body is standing united to fight for the future of our children and grandchildren. Those are legitimate fights, and I respect my colleague from across the aisle. These are legitimate fights that we are having here. However, today as I stand, I came to this body also looking for practical things and looking for things that amaze me at times, and this is one that does. But as we do and as we fight for others, we must ensure that the basic rights of all Americans are protected and do not fall victim to the political theater occurring in this body. Military personnel and their families make sacrifices that many of us cannot fathom, and they do so to protect the freedom that we take far too often for granted. Because of their sacrifice, our nation is a beacon of hope to the dark corners of the world where freedom of speech and religion exist only in fairy tales. Yet today, military chaplains who have been contracted to come to bases face a closed door. They cannot go, even if they wanted to volunteer, to practice their faith on these bases during a lapse of appropriations. Each of us in this body across the nation should pause for a moment to consider, think about what I just said. If a chaplain wants to minister, a contract chaplain wants to minister to a military member stationed abroad who has no access to a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, they would be in violation of the law. I'm a military chaplain, and this breaks my heart. Too often we come to this floor and we talk in abstracts. We talk about concepts, political jargon, arguing about problems that only matter probably within less than 3 miles of this building. But today is different. Today we stand with one resounding voice to tell our service members in the chaplaincy that we will not stand for their First Amendment rights to be violated because the leaders of the other body want to make a point. The laws of this nation require the federal government to ensure military personnel can express their faith or non-faith in all corners of the world. That is why the military chaplaincy exists, and the need for those that when we cannot serve, we contract with others who can provide that basis of their faith. General George Washington issued an order on July 9, 1776, providing through the Continental Congress for a chaplain for each regiment, stating, "The blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially so in times of public distress and danger." The administration is apparently unsatisfied with denying veterans access to memorials, unsatisfied with closing off unmanned scenic overlooks to motorists. Now they must go after, in the words of George Washington, the blessing and protection of heaven for our military families. The body has seen its share of political discord and policy disagreements. The government has experienced numerous lapses in appropriations over the decades, but never before in the history of this nation have the military chaplains and those that they contract with to serve our military personnel been prevented from meeting the religious and spiritual needs of our service members. As a chaplain, I lived and worked alongside men and women in Iraq. Many were religious and many were not.
but my purpose was to ensure that they were able to express their First Amendment rights however they wished. Military chaplains must be allowed, and their contract counterparts must be allowed to provide religious service and ministry regardless of our nation's fiscal state. If the administration wants to play games and score points through unnecessary theatrics, so be it. But I will not stand by and let these games occur at the expense of basic rights of our men and women in uniform. During this lapse in funding, active duty chaplains are permitted to continue serving military personnel. However, there's a chronic shortage of active duty chaplains, particularly for Catholic and Jewish faiths. For example, roughly 25% of the military ascribe to the Catholic faith, but yet Catholic priests make up only 8% of the chaplain corps. That means that approximately 275,000 men and women in uniform and their families are served by only 234 active duty priests, thus the need to have contract chaplains. Due to the shortage of active duty chaplains, it is extremely common for the government to employ chaplains via contract to ensure the spiritual needs of all our military members are met. With the government shut down, contract members of the chaplain corps on military bases worldwide are not permitted to work, not even permitted to volunteer, even if they're the only chaplain on base. As my friend from South Carolina and others have mentioned, the restrictions on basic freedoms that are being had around here and just within this area, at Langley, at the Navy Yard, at Fort Belvoir, these are all areas in which these have already been cut back, and that is a shame. I'm grateful to my colleagues who joined me this morning and the House leadership for their commitment to ensuring that military chaplains are able to serve the men and women of our armed forces. If this body does not pass this legislation, the ability of military personnel and their family to worship and participate in religious ceremonies will continue to be at great risk. I ask all my colleagues to join me in protecting the First Amendment rights of those who give their lives to protect ours. And before I close, I agree that many times we haven't communicated, and we don't communicate as many would want us to. But I've also heard that timing was a problem here, and that we should have saw this coming. Well, let me just say timing should never be a hindrance to this body protecting the First Amendment rights of any of our citizens, and especially our military personnel. In fact, it should be our highest calling and the thing we run to this floor to discuss. And should we have seen it coming? I tell you, what saddens me is I would have never believed that the administration or anyone else would deem protecting a constitutional right as non-essential. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 58? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking a vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings.
Immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3223, a bill to provide for the compensation of furloughed federal employees.
Pursuant to House Resolution 370 on oversight and government reform. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 3223 and to include extraneous material thereon.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Mr. Speaker, the House remains actively engaged in finding a solution to end the current impasse. The House has passed a number of common sense bills to fund our troops, continuing funding for veterans benefits, and allow the District of Columbia to spend its own funds. The House has also passed legislation to bring defense civilian employees back to work. Unfortunately, the administration appears to be purposefully refusing to use the authority granted by the Pay Our Military Act, meaning roughly 400,000 defense civilian employees remain at home, unable to work. While we wait on the President and Senate to reach across the aisle, it is important to provide needed certainty to federal employees who have been furloughed without pay. Each and every one of us has federal employees in our district, most of whom are guided by a sense of civic duty and take pride in helping make their country a better place. Civilian defense personnel at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, doctors and nurses at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and records management professionals at the National Archives, and countless other dedicated men and women throughout my community are employed by federal agencies and have been subject to furlough. In the Gulf Coast region and other disaster-prone areas, NOAA employees help prepare for and monitor major storms. In the aftermath of these natural disasters, FEMA workers are sent into horrible and hazardous conditions to help restore broken communities. At NASA, employees help us figuratively and literally reach for the stars. They encourage future generations to not be bound by seemingly physical and intellectual barriers. Our law enforcement agencies work tirelessly to investigate and capture those who seek to do harm to the homeland as well as our allies abroad. And the list goes on. H.R. 3223 ensures that federal civilian workers will receive retroactive pay for the duration of their federal government shutdown, regardless of their furlough status. Federal workers who have been furloughed under a shutdown historically have received their pay retroactively. H.R. 3223 provides today's workforce a guarantee that their pay will resume once the President and Senate Democrats agree to meaningful discussions that will ultimately resolve this impasse. I urge support for this bill as we continue to work on legislation to reopen critical operations of the federal government. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Maryland.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman yields is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 3223, the Federal Employee Retroactive Pay Fairness Act. This legislation would provide back pay to 800,000 hard-working and dedicated federal employees furloughed as a result of the government shutdown we are now enduring. Today is day 5 of the shutdown created by the Tea Party extremists who are harming our country by holding our government hostage. They're placing our economy and our national security in jeopardy by waging an ideological war to overturn the law of the land and put insurance companies back in charge of health care decisions for tens of millions of our fellow Americans. Our dedicated public servants ought to be at their duty stations serving the American people right now. They want to be working. They should be working. But instead, they are locked out because the House Republican leadership refuses to allow a vote on a clean bill to fund the government, a bill that would pass today. 17 years ago, federal workers were given back pay after Newt Gingrich's record 21-day shutdown in 1995 and 1996. It was a fair thing to do then, and it is a fair thing to do now. Our federal employees have been under relentless and unfair attack in recent years and have sacrificed much already. They have contributed nearly $100 billion to deficit reduction through the 3-year pay freeze. New employees have seen their retirement benefits slashed. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, many have suffered through sequester-imposed furloughs. And now, many families have seen their lives needlessly disrupted by this shutdown. The least we can do for our fellow citizens who work for this great country is to give them the reassurance of knowing that they will receive back pay. The irresponsible, piecemeal approach to government funding being pursued by our House Republicans omits huge parts of the government and attempts to pick and choose those who will be paid and those who won't. That is not an efficient or effective way to run the government. And the American people are sick of it, and they must be heard. H.R. 3223, and I give great credit to my colleagues, Mr. Moran and to Mr. Wolf, a bipartisan group of great Virginians. I applaud them, but this 3223 would ensure that all federal workers will be paid once this manufactured crisis is over and the government is reopened. This is not their fault, and they should not suffer as a result. It's long past time for Republicans to reopen the government. Instead of disrupting the lives of our fellow citizens and wasting time and taxpayer money, House Republicans should reopen the government today, not yesterday, right now, by simply bringing to the floor a measure that funds the entire government without taking away the health care of our fellow citizens. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join all of us in supporting H.R. 3223, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, the author of the bill we're considering today that would retroactively restore the pay to federal workers.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I want to thank Mr. S. Unanimous consent, revise and extend. I want to thank Mr. Turner. I want to thank Chairman Rogers and his staff. I also want to thank Leader Cantor and his staff, and Mr. Moran, Mr. Cummings, and the others, and all the staff, my staff too have been helped, but all the staff who did this very, very quickly. This was done during the Reagan administration. It was done during the Clinton administration. Who are the federal employees? The federal employees are the FBI agents that everyone would call. If they got a call and found out their loved one was kidnapped, the first person they would call would be an FBI agent, a federal employee. I was with Mr. Hoyer 2 weeks ago at the Navy Yard. The 12 people who were killed at the Navy Yard and those who were wounded, they were all federal employees. And Mr. Hoyer can tell you, when the CNO talked about it, he said they are part of the fleet. They are part of the fleet. The Capitol Hill policemen that we all got up the other day and gave a standing ovation, they are federal employees. The VA doctors that are working out at Walter Reed, working on young men and women who have lost limbs, who have served in Afghanistan and Iraq, they are federal employees. I remember I was with, again, Mr. Hoyer when we were down at OPM earlier this year when they had stars on the wall of 27 federal employees that died since 2012. And since that time, the number of stars have been added tremendously. I saw the movie Zero Dark 30. If you looked at that movie, it was about catching bin Laden. The woman who did it, Maya, has she been furloughed? Where is Maya? We don't know where she is, but has she been furloughed? Should she not get paid? And lastly, I remember being at the memorial service. If you saw the book and read the movie, 7 families walked in. 7 individuals died. And I saw the young families, the families who were mourning their parents. They are federal employees. There are about 12,000 CIA employees have been furloughed and have gone, maybe missing that one communication from Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda. I strongly urge a strong vote for this and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio, reserves. Reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from the state of Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to thank my colleague Frank Wolf. There's no harder advocate, more effective advocate for federal employees than Frank Wolf. He and I have worked together for over 32 years on behalf of the interest of those people who work for the American people every day to make them safer, healthier, more informed. I want to thank myself, the majority leader. I want to thank the ranking member. I want to thank the gentleman who offers his support of this bill. And I want to thank my colleagues. Mr. Speaker, we're 5 days into a government shutdown caused by, well, I'm not sure what it's caused by. As a result, approximately 800,000 middle-class workers who serve the American people are furloughed without pay. All of us talk about working Americans, how we want to make sure they have the jobs that they need to support themselves and their family. Our federal employees have already been asked to accept COLA freezes for the past 4 years, and they've endured changes to retirement benefits as well as the furloughs imposed by the irrational policy of sequester. I'm glad to see the chairman of the Appropriations Committee on the floor. There's been no more stronger voice on the irrationality of the sequester than my friend from Kentucky. Only my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can say with certainty, if they can, when our federal government will be able to go back to work. But the American people are already noticing their absence, whether safeguarding our national parks, performing groundbreaking medical research at NIH, overseeing disaster relief efforts after a storm or wildfire, making sure nutrition assistance gets to the children and seniors who need it, or enforcing the laws that keep our communities safe. Federal employees make a critical contribution to the country and communities and the American people they serve. We saw their selfless nature and devotion to country on display this Thursday when, as the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf said, when U.S. Capitol Police personnel, federal employees who are deemed essential for security and are currently on the job without the promise of pay, protected all of us who work in the Capitol complex during a security incident. I am proud to represent 62,000 hardworking federal employees in my district. Yet most of the federal employees are not in the Washington metropolitan area. 80% of them are dispersed throughout this country, serving in every area, every community of our great land. Many of whom serve in civilian defense roles at critical military institutions like Pax River, Indian Head, and Webster Field in my district, but each one of you could name a facility in your district. One of them wrote to me to express his frustration with those who are preventing the government from reopening. He writes, and I quote, "I'm quite tired of being punished when my only crime is supporting our great nation with my labor." May I have one additional minute?
Grant the gentleman an additional minute.
I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
And I want to thank my Republican colleagues for recognizing that pain and unfairness and bringing this bill to the floor. I hope all of us will support this bill. Another constituent of mine who works at Pax River said this: please continue to work toward a solution that ends the furloughs for all federal employees affected by the shutdown, not just a select few, as we're doing. Mr. Speaker, we must reopen our government, and we could do so today, this hour. But until the majority allows a vote on the bill to reopen the government, let us at least provide the dedicated, patriotic federal employees who want nothing more than to go back to work with a peace of mind that they will still be paid for their service. I want to thank Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, like Mr. Wolf, has been an extraordinary leader on behalf of federal employees. Gerald Connolly, Congressman Connolly, Steve Lynch sits here. Others on the Republican side who have been aligned on that effort as well. Surely we, the board of directors of the greatest enterprise on earth, can take care of our employees and give them confidence that they deserve. And I thank the Speaker for the additional time, and I yield back the balance of the time I don't have.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland Reserve. Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank the chairman for yielding me this time. This is a bipartisan bill, and I hope every member in this House will be happy to support it. I'm glad to see that at the very least the Senate has plans to take up this bill. Stop the presses. The Senate's going to take up a bill, even if they won't consider most of our other bills. And as we wait for the Senate to come to the negotiating table on shutting the shutdown down, our federal workforce should not wait to find out whether or not they'll be paid. This bill will provide back pay for those workers who've been furloughed in a fair, full, and timely manner after the shutdown ends. The House has made great strides toward this end. In fact, as of yesterday, the House has approved 15 different options to fund the government, sent them over to the Senate. Sadly, the only response is a loud snore. I hope this bill, which I know is a priority for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, will encourage this Congress to find that spirit of bipartisanship that seems to have evaporated over the last few weeks. It will demonstrate that we are able to let level heads prevail and that we can unite in our responsibility to care for the hundreds of thousands of people who serve this nation day in, day out. I want to thank Mr. Wolf and Mr. Moran, two very fine members of our Appropriations Committee, for bringing this bill to the floor, and I salute them, urge my colleagues to provide our workforce with some certainty for their futures and pass this bill.
Gentleman time has expired. The gentleman for Ohio Reserve.
I reserve the yes.
Yes, gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to distinguished sponsor of the bill from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank my very close friend from Baltimore, Maryland, for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, this bill is truly bipartisan. We have 177 co-sponsors, 32 Republicans. It ensures that all federal employees will be paid for the duration of the federal government shutdown. The issue is fairness. It's just wrong